As NATO leaders prepare to gather for a summit later this week, the list of problems facing the West appears to mount by the day. From the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the advance of ISIS in Iraq, it's almost difficult to know where to start. With me to discuss the growing list of crises facing the alliance and its members and how they should deal with them is Gideon Rachman, the FT's chief foreign affairs commentator. Gideon, hello. Is it a coincidence that we're seeing, not just the ones that we named there, but there's a whole raft of sort of problems, crises facing the West, broadly defined, that all seem to be coming up at the same time?
Well, on one level, it clearly is a coincidence in the sense that I don't think ISIS are coordinating their actions with Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. On the other hand, I think what you can see is a series of challenges to a global security order that is essentially underwritten by the United States, whether that's in Europe or in the Middle East or in Asia. And in a sense, one challenge provokes the other because people think, well, maybe the Americans aren't really up for it anymore. Maybe they won't push back. And if they see weakness in the Middle East, perhaps that provokes people in Europe. It's a little hard to pin down.
Is what you're saying is basically American weakness? That, it's almost, we had almost the acknowledgement that, our strategy is we don't really have a strategy.
Well, you're certainly, within the United States, President Obama himself is getting a lot of criticism for being, inverted commas, weak and for showing lack of resolve. Going back even actually to last summer when he drew this red line over Syria and then didn't enforce it. And you hear that also from American allies around the world. But actually, I think that's pretty unfair as a criticism because what's happening, if you look certainly at defense expenditure, is that America is being asked to do more and more. So that if you look at NATO, which is meeting this week in Wales, 10 years ago, NATO spending was about 50% Europeans and 50% the US. As Europeans have cut their defense budgets, it's now America spending 75% of the NATO budget is coming out of the United States. And yet actually America is less directly threatened by events in Ukraine or the Middle East than the Europeans are. So the Europeans and indeed the Middle Eastern allies of the US and the Asian allies are all kind of looking to America to do more, even as they don't really do that much about their own security.
So do you see any of that changing? Because we've heard, the whole issue, particularly around the Europeans, about, they're supposed to be meeting this 2% of GDP spending on defense, which they have, most of them haven't met for a while. We know that, we've heard that for quite a while, but do you see any shift this time? Or is it just going to be the same as before?
Well, we'll see. I think it's going to be a very interesting acid test of how frightened and how seriously the Europeans take what's happening in Ukraine, because on the surface they seem very alarmed. On the other hand, they're all, almost all, facing huge pressure to cut their budgets in every conceivable area. And of course, if you're, say, the government of France or the government of Germany, your voters care more about their welfare payments, about their pensions, than they do about putting that little bit of extra money into defense.
But do you not think that Ukraine is going to change that a bit? One senses, particularly in places like Germany, where there has been, as you mentioned, a long sort of resistance for obvious historical reasons, but towards sort of military engagement and more assertive foreign policy and actually spending on matters like defence, that there is a sort of shift?
Look, I think there's certainly a possibility, and I think that the US will be putting pressure on. And I think some of the European governments would like to do it themselves. But I must admit, I'm actually a little bit sceptical for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think that faced with the choice between spending on voters and the voters feel and spending on defence, governments will still tend to spend on welfare or whatever. And secondly, European voters are much less convinced of the case for confronting Russia than European governments. So I think that actually increasing defence spending, deploying troops to the Baltic states would be deeply controversial in countries like Germany. So that's another reason why it's going to be hard for NATO to get its act together. On the other hand, I would argue that if they don't, then this sense of American weakness will actually be amplified because it's a double weakness. It's actually more in Europe than the United States, but it reinforces each other. If the Americans feel, well, look, even the Europeans aren't serious about sticking up for themselves, what really is their incentive to go out and put themselves on the line?
And if you're Vladimir Putin watching all this, it's probably quite encouraging, perhaps.
Sure. Encouraging and discouraging. It's interesting to try to put yourself in his shoes. On the one hand, he does see a West that's clearly divided, uncertain, arguing amongst itself. On the other hand, he's got 28 countries meeting to try to think about how they're going to deal with Russia. It's 28-1. So I wouldn't feel that reassured if I was the Russians.
Right. Gideon Rachman, thank you very much.